Good afternoon.
Hello.
Okay, no, it's only Monday. You have to have more energy than that. Come on. Good afternoon.
There we go.
There we go. Make sure everybody else in the other rooms can hear how much fun we're having in here with Apex 10 Commandments.
And we will have fun today.
If you're looking for the dunk tank with Benioff, that's in the room next door, though. Okay? Awesome.
Maybe sassy, too. Welcome to the Apex 10 Commandments session. Glad to have you here. My name is James Lothry. I am a technical architect at EDL Consulting. I'm a Force.com MVP and a Salesforce MVP and 4 times certified.
He likes tests.
I'm a glutton for punishment.
I'm Kevin Poorman. I also work for EDL Consulting. I'm a principal architect, and I'm not such a big test fan, but I am a Force.com MVP. So we have 10 commandments for Apex development. These are things that we think should be mandatory requirement. You should have tattooed on the inside of your eyelids, etc., for doing Apex development. And I get going over the first 5. A little bit about this. About a year and a half ago, a guy named Francis Pindar and I were having a Twitter conversation about how annoying it was to get dropped into an org that somebody else had set up and done a whole bunch of work in. And they didn't have any idea what they were doing. So we thought maybe we could come up with some best practices, but that seemed a little too buzzwordy. So we came up with 10 commandments because that seemed a little bit more biblical, because if you break these, biblical things should happen. Floods, earthquakes, plagues, frogs from the sky.
Your org being banished or something like that.
Yes. So, number 1, thou shalt keep things, and things being code, stupid simple. The KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. Here is a lovely bit of code. Does it look simple? This is the interactive bit. You have to talk back to me. Does this look simple? Yes. All right, let's look at this top part. What is it doing? We have a Boolean method that says is true, and it accepts a Boolean variable, and it says if the Boolean variable is true, return true. I wish I hadn't found that in a real org. Don't do that. Don't do that. Keep things simple. Use types for what they are. Return the Boolean if you want to have a function for it. I'm still not entirely sold on the idea of having a is true function, but if you want one, go with that method. All right. Number 2. Where did my code go?
Next slide.
Oh, there we go. Thou shalt not put queries in for loops. So for loops, wonderful things. Let's do this to every element in our collection. One thing we should never do, though, is we should never have a query like we do on line 5. In this line 5, we're going to generate a list of contacts for this account. That's inside the for loop. That will break after how many accounts processed? 150. 200. Anybody else want to throw a vote in? Oh, here, what do you got? 201. James?
100.
100. It's 100. On the 101st query, you'll get an exception. All right? Don't do that. Instead, have a list of accounts and use a subselect query. Select the ID and email from contacts. And do one query for everything up front. And then you can go over in your loop and look and see if the contact email is null, and if it is, add to the count. Okay? So use subselects, use subqueries to your benefit. Go ahead and use these rather than trying to put things in, putting queries in a loop. So what do we not do here? Queries in for loops. Okay. Thou shalt not put DML in for loops. This is related to the second one here. So down here on line 19 in the yellow section at the bottom, we have update account. That's in a for loop. That seems innocuous enough, but it will break after how many times? We have 150, we got 200. How many times can you use DML in a trigger or a class? 10.
Yep.
Don't do that.
Don't be that guy.
Don't be that guy. People will write tweets about you.
And we have.
No comment. Instead, you can do this. You have a query, like the same query we had before. We're going to have a subquery at the top, and the laser pointer is not showing up on the white screen, so forgive me here. Look on line 3 and 4. There we have a subquery. And then on line 10, we've added this new list of accounts. So we're going to create a list. It's going to be blank. It's going to be a list of accounts. And as we go through and do our updates, we're going to add the updated account to our list of accounts rather than doing the insert or the update right there in the loop. When we get done, down at the bottom on line 25, we can update all of those accounts with one DML statement. So instead of putting that DML in the loop, we add the items to a list, and then we update the list. Make sense?
This is especially an important thing to do in your triggers. More often than not, you'll find poorly written DML statements in your trigger code. So,
and I got nods over here that this makes sense, but not over here. So we're doing a left versus right comparison thing, A/B testing. So does this make sense? Okay, there we go.
What's Astro?
We wanted to have like we wanted to have a best practices for our best practices, so we thought we'd say Astro says. So Astro says, why bulkification? There's a lot of reasons for bulkification. One of them is it's a multi-tenant architecture, and that means that you're on my hardware, and you're on my hardware, and I'm on your hardware, and we're all together working in the same hardware. And so all of us are really invested in all of us being really good at what we do when we write software. And the limits are there to keep us from overruling and overrunning everybody else's ability to get their work done as well. So we have governor limits, and we use bulkification, like adding things to a list and then updating that entire list at once rather than doing individual updates for individual records in a loop. Number 4. This is probably my personal vendetta. Thou shalt only put one trigger per object. I've been in a good number of orgs where we'll have I've seen up to 15 triggers on the account object. And the thing with the triggers is you don't know what order they're going to run in. You're not guaranteed any sort of order of execution, and 15 triggers is a lot of things to look through to try and figure out where the problem is occurring if you're debugging something. So don't do that. Put one trigger on the account, and instead put all of your trigger code in a class, and when you call that, when that trigger fires, make it call out to the class, right? So we're going to put all of our logic in a class. This does two things for us. One, it gives us control over the order of execution, because in our class we can control what part of which trigger is being fired at which time, or what was a trigger at which time. And two, we can test it a lot easier. Because it's a class, we can test individual methods in that class rather than testing the whole thing, whole kit and caboodle running once when the trigger fires in a DML statement. Number 5 is related to it, and that's why they're sort of together. Thou shalt not put code in triggers other than calling methods and managing execution order. So, like I said before, you want one trigger per object, and you want that trigger to fire in all the various, all the various contexts you have. So in this case, our trigger will fire after delete, after insert, after update, and before insert. And when that trigger fires, it will have code in here that determines what context it's in, and it will do nothing more than call class methods in our class that handles the logic. So all we're doing here at the bare minimum is brokering what is running when and at what time, and we're going to put all the logic in the class. Those two make sense together?
Another advantage that gives you too is that your triggers require at least 1% code coverage. So it's an easier way to manage your code coverage and stuff when you separate out your logic from your triggers into a separate class.
And a more subtle benefit of that is if you put all of your logic in a class, that class has to have 75% code coverage in order to deploy. So by the time you get to deploying your triggers in the classes, you're going to automatically have more confidence that your code is sensible and logical and works. So with that, with the first 5 underneath us, we can take a deep breath, and I'll pass it on to James.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So I'll be going over commandments 6 through 10. First one is, number 6 actually, is as a developer, I have a tendency to want to get my go right straight to Apex to write your solution. Now, it might make sense in like a Java world or something like that. However, Salesforce has lots of booked-in or declarative functionality right off the bat. Things like workflow rules, validation rules, flow triggers, which are coming in the near future. Things like custom settings for maps, and also formulas. So formulas can give you a good way for removing a need for duplicating fields and logic like that. So one of the things you need to know as a developer is when to use Apex, when to not use Apex. If you've taken the 401 developer exam, they go over that quite a bit in detail. So you really need to know when to use a workflow rather than when to use your Apex trigger tool set. So as Asher says, you need to know which tool is right for the job. And a benefit that gives you too is it keeps your code simple. If most of your logic is in declarative, if you have administrators that like to kind of dig into your code a little bit, it's easier for them to understand if you use more declarative stuff rather than customization in Apex. 7, as I kind of alluded, thou shalt utilize maps for queries when needed. One of the common questions on the developer boards has to do with utilizing or not utilizing maps. So if you're not familiar with maps or how to construct them, like right straight from a SOQL query, for instance, take a look at line 29 and learn and love it, because maps are a savior with your Apex triggers. So number 8, thou shalt make use of relationships to reduce queries whenever possible. SOQL isn't necessarily intuitive when you first dive into it. When I first dove into SOQL, I came from a MySQL or SQL or Sybase or whatever background, and it's not necessarily intuitive that you can do these subqueries. But once you learn to use these subqueries, it's easier to navigate the parent relationships and then down to the children relationships as well. So it kind of goes back to the same commandment 1 and 2, just basically keeping your code simple and less code makes it easy. Number 9 is kind of near and dear to my heart. One of the first things I do when I go to a project is I kind of strive towards test-driven development, right? I don't know if we have any other test-driven development fans out here, but the idea is, do we? Who likes test-driven development? Raise your hand. Woo! All right, come on. Need some more participation. All right.
It's a tough crowd, Jim.
Yeah. I need Amber to...
We need a song
there
and
we
dance
go.
number
there
here.
There we go. All right, so in general, your test should test for all your conditions. It's easy enough to, write a I++ statement and assert that I equals 1 after that code runs, right? But what happens if there's a null pointer exception or something happens? So you want to test for your positive effects, but you also want to test for those negative effects. Null pointer exceptions is one of them, but you also want to test for exceptions that may occur in like callouts or whatever. So throw your bad data in there and test out how your code's going to work. Another thing that's also important to remember is using testing as a particular user. So if your code uses with sharing, it may operate differently in one context of a certain user rather than another context of, say, a system admin. So you want to test for different users, profiles. You want to test for your negative effects, positive effects. You also want to test for bulkification. So who here uses their unit test in a bulkified manner? Who here creates more than one record when they create mock data in their unit tests? Anybody? Okay. Ideally, you want to create at least 200 records, and the reason for that is a trigger will run in the context of 200 records. So you could do 400, it'd be kind of useless, I think, but you want to test for 200 records as a kind of a general goal to strive for. And some of this material here is also on your certification exams, so want to remember that too. All right. So 10 is pretty similar. Thou shalt write meaningful and useful tests. So we talked about the positive, which tests to test for. A test is useless without system asserts, however. Who here has written a test but forgot to include a system assert? And you're like, hey, it succeeds. Come to find out, your code's still broken. Anybody? All right. So what we wanted to point out here is there's more than one system assert method. So you can say system assert A equals B as a comparison. And then there are all these three methods here. So A system assert equals, and system assert not equals. They are all overloaded with a second or third parameter that says, when this test fails, then show me this message. So if A was not equal to B in this case, I would see a test failure, and it would say A does not equal to B. And that's apparent when you run your tests through your favorite IDE, like Maven's Main or Eclipse, or if you run them through the Apex test execution scenario in the setup, in the general browser setup. Also, the more assertions, the better. One of the common pitfalls I see with unit tests is that there's just one assert. So maybe you're asserting that a list is not null, or maybe the size or something, but you don't actually go through like a list and verify all the contents of there. So when you're writing a test, and say you're using a list, and just a broad example, you want to go actually loop through that list and verify that your data is what you expect. Now, you don't have to go crazy with it, just enough that you're comfortable with how the code runs.
Now, that said, you can go a little crazy with system asserts. I found an org once I inherited about 2 months ago. The previous developer was self-taught, was trying very hard. He did all of the right things. He went through and he wrote asserts for every property on the object he got back from his method, including the ID field. Which, you kind of gloss over it when you're first reading the code, but when you do catch it, and you're like, whoa. So be sensible about it.
Yep. And if you add too many system asserts too, sometimes it can bite you when you're deploying or something, some minor conditional change. Maybe one that you don't care about, for instance. And so there's kind of a good balance there, is what I'm trying to say. Another one. So who here loves the see all data equals true annotation? Who loves to use existing product data or existing data?
There's a right answer to this.
There's a one hand in the back. I think he's going to be smitten by, or smoten, or whatever the verb tense is there, by Astro. So whatever your unit test is, and finally they've removed the existing condition for price books. Can I get a cheer for that one? Yeah. So there's literally no reason anymore that you need to use that existing, the old API from version 18 or something like that. I don't know. It was a long time ago. So yeah, you can create mock data at will, and strongly suggest that you use that.
So one of the things I didn't realize when I first started doing Force.com development is when you create mock data within a test context, that data is deleted from the database when the test finishes. So you don't have to worry about running up your storage limits or getting duplicate records or putting any of that kind of data in your test org or in your production org as the tests run. This stuff will all be deleted out. It'll be rolled back when your test is completed. Good, pass or fail. So it's a double-edged sword here. You're going to get rid of it. You don't have to worry about it when the tests pass, but if the tests fail, you can't go see what happened there. You have to go look at the logs.
Yep. All right. Good point. Let's see. So yeah, the more assertions, the better. Mock data. You want to use mock data as much as possible. And we already said this before, but test all the conditions, not just your positive test cases. And one of my scenarios, one of the things I like to rely on is one criteria per unit test. So say you have a method that performs maybe 3 different bits of logic. So you want to provide basically 3 or more unit tests for that particular method and test each of those different pieces of logic individually. That way you just know what's going on with your code, and you're comfortable with that it works. All right. Then we have a couple examples here. So in this example, we are using the test.start test and test.stop test, which I didn't mention in the prior code, but it's a good practice to use as well. We are creating a user in this case, and then my favorite test user, which is Batman. As a funny little anecdote, I created a Batman user, a Batman mock test user, and it got deployed to production. However, the test failed because somebody had actually registered Bruce Wayne at WayneEnterprises.com. So, and this is like within I don't know, a couple weeks or something of writing it. So I was like, what? Why is the test failing now? Jerks. Anyway. So, this is just demonstrating that you can run a test as a particular user, and again, that's testing the profiles and the roles and kind of the sharing permissions and stuff that go along with that. Take a look at line 141 or so. We're looping through, and we're asserting that the contact is, we're asserting that every contact is what we expect. So that goes back to the system assertion statement earlier. Just another example here. So this is an exception. This is one of the kind of frameworks-ish that I use for testing exceptions. You have a Boolean that says your exception was not encountered, and then you invoke some code that you would expect to throw an exception, and then you set the Boolean to, that should be true. I don't know why it says false there, but it should be true at line 151. And then you do a system assert at line 155. And again, that's using the overloaded system assert method there. So if an exception is not encountered, it'll say controller did not throw an exception in your test results. Okay. Third, I think, final example. Yep. All right. Give a little sneak peek there. So we're just showing again that we're using mock data. We're not relying on existing data, and then just more system assert examples here. I think this is kind of more of the same. So, bonus commandment. We have 11th commandment. I got a couple requests for 15 commandments based on the Blazing Saddles movie, but I didn't get it thrown in here.
Wouldn't be prudent.
So, thou shalt free to break these as wisdom merits. Wisdom merits. Wow. All right. I'm a little tired. Sometimes you just need a list of IDs. You don't necessarily need a map or anything like that. These commandments, despite their name, they're guidelines for the most part. Break them if you need to. You might find you're desperate to deploy something to production, and it might go against your best wishes. But except, as Asher says, except for the bulkifying and the bulkifying of your queries and your DML operations. That's a no-no. And with that, we'll open up to questions and answers.
Actually, I want to pause here for just a second and say, so these 10 commandments, 11 commandments, are great, but that doesn't necessarily translate into how you follow them. And so I just want to throw out a couple words on that. The best way I've ever found to have a project that actually follows these all the way through to the end is to start my project not in front of a computer screen, but in front of a whiteboard or a sheet of paper. What do I need to do? How do I test what I need to do? I've covered now my testing ones. I'm covered now what my logic classes are going to be, at least roughly. And I can talk about who needs to be able to do that logic. So now I can test my permissions-based tests. I can look at and say, am I ever going to be handling 200 or 4,000 of these records at a time? And determine whether or not I can use an Apex class or if I have to use a batch class. Starting out on paper or a whiteboard, some other mutable thing that you can just really quickly scribble over.
Or even text editor or something in Mac, yeah.
Yeah. The key, though, is don't start writing code. Start writing not requirements. Start writing down logical groups, like I have to do this, I have to do that. Almost like a checklist. You take your checklist, and then you can break it down to, I need to be able to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to test it with A, B, and C for X and Y users. Great. Well, that's a framework of things I can do. I can write classes to do A, B, and C. I can write tests that test A, B, and C, and I can write tests that test it with those users. And I've done 7 of the 10 right there. All I have to do now is not write queries that have in for loops and not write DML in for loops. Now I've got 9 of the 10. Which one didn't I mention? Now you have to talk back. Which one did I miss? Keep it simple. Yes, exactly. So questions, answers, and I will ask more questions if you don't.
And there are mics in the middle, so go ahead and step up to those and ask.
I do have a question. So what is your thoughts on, I've noticed when I do try bulking up my test class up to over 200, my test class take a lot longer to run. We got, I think last time I checked, over 150. So, and right now, even with me skinning them down to using just maybe like a couple records, like 2 at least at a time, it still takes about 10 minutes for it to run through.
I have a magic number in my head that of a set that I always test with. For general situations. That number is 73.
So
Here's
pick a
why.
number and go.
Here's why. 1, I pulled it out of my hat. And 2, it's big enough that I'm going to run into any DML. I'm going to catch any DML in loops. I'm going to catch any queries in loops in general. Not always, but in general. And in general, if I've got 73, then I'm definitely testing in bulk. It also tends to run faster than one that has 200 or 250. My exception to that is I always test with exactly 200 when I'm testing a batch class.
Okay.
And you can only test with 200.
And you can only test with 200.
Or at the most 200.
So I always use the max there because they're tricky.
Okay. And then the second question I have is, I know you said don't use existing data, but I have found that if I don't use existing user data, that if you don't have enough licenses, you'll actually end up having the class fail because it can't create the user.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess my suggestion to that would be just leave a user license open. I mean, that's the best way. I mean, your user is going to be deleted after the
They
test
don't
runs.
control the licenses, so
Yeah,
I
I know.
can't do that.
There's no good answer for that.
I think the answer to that is to go back to the business and make a business case for 1 extra license. That extra license.
I have a very small to like mid-sized company, so that ain't gonna happen, but it's worth a shot too. I was just wondering if there was a better method other than like, you know.
The other thing I'll say is there might be 7 ideas on the idea exchange about how test classes should be able to create a user without it counting
Yes.
against your, and
Yes,
you should go
please.
find all 7 of them and vote for them with every account you have.
If you could post that to the chatter group, that'd be great.
I'm sorry, say that
If you
again?
could post that to the chatter group, that'd be great.
Okay, yes. And if you want to spin up dev orgs just for the accounts to vote for them, I'm okay with that. Let's Chicago this. Vote early, vote often, vote for your dead grandmother.
Yeah, we have like 10 ideas apiece or whatever that, you know, feel free to vote for too with all those accounts that you create as well.
Yeah. Other questions? Those are great questions, by the way.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So when we're dealing with an org that has a managed package installed and we can't actually see the trigger,
Right.
and we can't get rid of the 10 triggers that the silly package installed,
Right.
best practice?
You might be SOL from your standpoint. What I do is go back to the managed package developer and ask, you know, for them to kind of, maybe not necessarily show you the code, but to kind of go over how you would approach a unit test or something like that. Okay. What you could suggest to them perhaps is like a trigger framework where you have a custom setting where you can turn off and on the trigger if you need to go that approach. But as far as installing that package, you really can't do a whole lot yourself.
Thanks.
I personally would file bugs with the vendor of the managed package. You should only have 1 trigger per object. Now, I say that if the managed package has a trigger on account and you have one on account, I don't have a problem with that. Because if their managed package trigger fails, that doesn't hurt you during a deploy. Your code has to pass your tests. Managed packages are somewhat exempted from that. They get emails when things fail. So, but I would still file a bug.
Okay.
Or at the very least, start a conversation with that package developer too.
About tarring and feathering them. No. Other questions?
Come on up.
Oh, here we go.
out one. So when you come into an org that has a ton of triggers, like on the account object, for example, and they're building logic all in throughout the triggers,
Yep.
moving forward from there, just pick one and build on there as well, or just forget about it and start building your own triggers?
I would start from scratch and start building your own trigger framework. And
go back and delete all those and make your own?
well,
or-
you basically copy the logic piecewise into your own trigger. That way you could guarantee what order of execution that the triggers fire in.
I'll try and post it to the chatter group too, but there's a great trigger framework by a guy named Kevin O'Hara.
We love that framework, both of us do.
Kevin O'Hara is a guy who works for a company called Level 11. They're a partner of Salesforce. They do gamification. And he created this trigger framework. It's beautifully simple. It's done in like 200 lines of code. You can drop the code and the test class in your org, and then you write classes that extend the trigger handler and put your logic in those classes, and the triggers themselves just fire your trigger handler. And that keeps everything clean and safe and nice, and it's simple enough and fast enough that if you inherit an org with 15 triggers on it, you can go back to the business and say, it's in your best interest to pay me to spend time to move these to a trigger handler for maintenance reasons than to just add another one on. Because the true cost of any software project is not in its development, but in its maintenance.
Yep.
Other questions?
Yep. Fine.
Hi. I'm an admin. I'm not a developer yet, but I want to be.
All admins are also developers.
Okay. But everything that you said made sense, except for the part about creating your create test data instead of using real data.
Yep.
That didn't make sense to me because I thought that if your real data was not pure or clean, that could maybe end up showing you something in your code that was needed to be compensated for, or so help me understand the benefit of that.
Okay, so when you rely on existing data, basically it can be deleted at will, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you write some test that depends on existing data in your sandbox, and it's not there in production.
Gotcha.
That's kind of the crux of the whole issue, right?
Okay.
Because your test is going to break, that data just doesn't exist, so you're going to throw a null pointer exception, or your data is just not going to be there, and it's going to break the test.
Okay.
Now, to go over your point, yeah, it's good to look at your overall data and kind of see where the pitfalls of, maybe you have some empty fields or something like that, or some invalid data. But your test should test for those situations as well.
And if in the future you come across a situation where your code didn't properly handle some live data in production, the answer to that is to write a unit test for it.
Yeah.
So when you find a flaw that triggers something, you write a unit test that proves the flaw, a negative test that proves the flaw, and then a positive test that shows how you handled it properly.
Okay.
And then you have a library of saying, hey, we found, like one of my favorite bugs of all time was a bug where certain people were passing in data to us in UTF-16 instead of UTF-8. And so every character that displayed was K space, E space, V space, I space, N space. And it drove us nuts trying to figure out why. But when we were done, we wrote a unit test trigger that pointed, a unit test that pointed out when we got a UTF-16 string in, we could properly translate that back. Now, if somebody else has that problem, they're going to immediately be able to look through our tests and see, oh, hey, this is weird, but we've seen something like this before.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. It's kind of a good way of documenting your defects too, almost like a Salesforce-related Jira or something like
Yeah.
that.
These have been great questions.
Yeah.
We've
Fantastic.
got 5 minutes, so we can, bring out the big guns, try and hurt us, stump us. And
Kevin bites, I don't, so.
But I've had my shots. Yes.
So what if your method is like really long and complicated and has lots of conditionals,
Yes.
and you spend like ages writing unit tests and most likely miss something? You still have to go through every single condition of compensation.
That's kind of what I was getting on the earlier slide. So for each branch of logic, each if statement in that case, or each for loop or whatever, I would write a separate unit test for that particular branch in logic. And it kind of reaches that point. Another way you can look at it too is look at your code coverage and see how your code's covering it. And it doesn't necessarily tell you it's covering it the right way that you're expecting. Like, basically, it just says you're touching that branch of logic, but it gives you an idea that you are hitting that particular branch.
And then when it goes into production, there's something you forgot about it, it's frozen.
Yeah.
So then you bring it to test for design.
Yep. Yep.
And the other thing I want to point out is if you're keeping things simple,
Yep.
you're not going to have really long methods. So, and I totally get that. I totally get that.
Right.
And the great example I have for that is I once had to write a method that calculated the income tax for Bolivia. What I ended up doing was having all of my conditionals actually branching out and putting them in separate methods. I have a theory. I picked it up from a Rubyist, a Ruby programmer named Davy Stevens. She wrote a thing that said the rules for writing Ruby code. And her rules for writing Ruby code are no class can be longer than 2 pages of scrolling. No method can be longer than 1 page of scrolling. And methods have to have useful names. Like you should be able to read the method name and say exactly what it does. And so, because Apex is much more verbose than Ruby, I'm a little bit more looser on my sizing. But in general, a class is no longer than 4 scrolls, and a method is no longer than 1 scroll. And I don't have a problem with having hundreds of methods, because I can test each individual method really easily. But putting them all together then becomes simpler. My Bolivian tax code ended up being a method of 6 lines. Now, each one of those lines called another method, was each 15 lines long, or etc. But it kept things very clear, and it broke it down into get the net income, get the tax bracket, get the so forth.
Yeah. One thing I want to add too is that there's a book called Beautiful Code. It's a blue book with like white text on the front, and it applies. I got it for my Java work, but it really applies. What's that? Sorry.
That book says that you should never have any conditionals on what the base of the factory.
Okay. I can't remember of that familiar, but sorry. But there's examples of just simplifying your code and the methods and stuff, and you're probably right. It kind of tries to cover a breadth of different languages, but it does have good tips for unit testing and test-driven development, like I mentioned earlier, and just kind of simplifying your code, making it easier to read, easier to maintain, and just more stable as well.
So following on from that question made me really think of one of the bad balances that you have to deal with. It's always a trade-off, but I like to code defensively. I like to be very careful to make sure that we handle all the potential exceptions and unexpected situations. Of course, the more you do that, the harder it is to get your coverage up. And then you wind up not having enough coverage to be able to release your code. I have not found a good answer for that. I have other developers I work with, and I try to get them to really think, to code defensively as much as possible. But the more they do that, the more they hurt themselves with coverage. So what's the right balance?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I mean,
I think I want to give you a very similar answer to the one answer I just gave this woman. I think the right answer, the right idea, is to have lots of small methods that you can individually unit test. And you can write a very defensive method that calls 15 other methods for type checking, for null checking, for all sorts of defensive measures, but is still in 5 lines of code. You can write one if statement. If all of these return true, proceed to the next step. Otherwise, throw a validation error.
And one thing I want to add real quick too is when you separate it out into methods like that too, you're going to reuse that code.
Yeah.
You're not going to have 20 string not empty checks, all over your code. You're going to have one nice sentence. Yep.
And you'll end up, I usually throw a class in called U. It's my utilities method, my utilities class, and everything in there is static. So u.null question, is this null? Yeah? Yeah, you're right, it does. Yeah. There's only so many times you can type utilities class. Like I said, you can break these as needed. It's bonus rule number 11. I think we have no more seconds. We're over by 10 seconds.
We're going up now.
So, thank you all for coming. You've been great.
Thank you so much.